What's up guys, Houndish here. Today, we're jumping back in time a little bit actually with some Destiny discussion. Most of you guys will know who Chris Barrett is, previously a game director for Destiny, and a high-level Bungie employee, who was also one of the leads for Marathon before his time with Bungie was terminated. You'll remember there was a bit of drama about some of the stuff that had gone on at Bungie. But today, Chris Barrett's given some insights about Destiny development going back in time, especially around a couple of specific releases that includes House of Wolves and Rise of Iron. Firstly though, a separate thing, I saw someone tweeted that Bungie had removed all Destiny-related job positions from the careers page at Bungie. And it's true when you look, there are no jobs specifically listed for Destiny. Some folks might say that's concerning. I do remember, maybe I looked at this a few months ago or a year ago or something, and there were still Destiny positions on there. So it might be concerning to some that there are no Destiny-related roles actually listed. But when you think about it, 2 of the roles are for studio tech, which I assume is for, Bungie servers, computers, tech that they actually use to make games, whatever. And 3 of the roles are for Marathon. And Marathon is in full-blown production right now, releasing in a couple of months' time. So if there are only 3 roles for that game, I wouldn't read into the fact that there are no roles for the Destiny franchise currently listed. I mean, it may mean something, but that's pure speculation. Also, some of these job roles, man, are really well paid. Look at that number at the bottom. Not that I know anything about game design, really, but it'd be nice, wouldn't it? And I guess it makes sense, as when Bungie and Chris Barrett fell out, Barrett pushed a $200 million lawsuit against Bungie, which has since been dismissed. And the reason for all that drama is that Barrett had some questionable interactions with other Bungie staff, which we won't go into in a ton of detail here again, as it's been spoken about. But recently, I guess, with all of that out of the way, Chris Barrett's actually spoken about some historic components of Destiny development. So there's an interesting one here. Prison of Elders design document. I'm still super proud of how much the team accomplished in House of Wolves with little confidence from leadership and minimal resources. And he says it was 3-ish months and a core team of 5 or 6 people to actually produce House of Wolves. And he mentions highlights like Skolas Encounter, the Reef Social Space, Pet Revenge, Trials, and the prologue trailer, as well as the overall PvP meta. The first thing to pick out is that they produced this in around 3 months apparently, and a core team of 5 or 6 people, we can assume that's not literally 5 or 6 people producing everything in relation to House of Wolves, but perhaps it refers to the dedicated team, while other folks, who are in sandbox or design, were perhaps working on multiple different releases and dealing with components of the House of Wolves release. Obviously not a thorough explanation, but it does paint a different picture from the concept that a Destiny release would require hundreds of developers and a year of development, right? But looking at this design document, it is kind of interesting, as it lists the different weeks and rotations of Prison of Elders that they were working on. And then for each of the challenges, there's the listing for the different rounds, so the enemy types, the bosses, and specific mechanics. I'm not sure whether they kind of write these mechanics out in advance and then try and actually build it in the game, or whether there's an earlier process with some kind of early development in game, and then these are more the kind of fine-tuning components. It's not entirely clear, but it's kind of cool to get a look at it. And House of Wolves was a pretty awesome time for Destiny in a lot of ways. Obviously, there's loads of nostalgia at this point. But Prison of Elders was pretty fun, and House of Wolves was also more expansive in that it released a new social space, and Trials of Osiris for the very first time, which is another big component of the game in general. You can see some of my really dodgy Skolas Encounter gameplay right here. But other questions arise from this on X. Someone said, what about Rise of Iron? How much time and resources? Chris Barrett said the team was a bit larger, but if I recall correctly, we had 4 or 5 months. Which again sounds like a pretty quick turnaround, Rise of Iron being significantly larger than House of Wolves. It reminds me as well how we used to get kind of hype-up events and things happening in the game. There was that whole owl sector thing, and then the multicolored nanites that we could get with the virus spreading from Guardian to Guardian. It was awesome when everything was new, exciting, and mysterious in Destiny. Other things that Chris Barrett touched on here though, somebody said it's crazy that PvP hasn't had a substantial new mode like Trials added since House of Wolves. Outside of Comp in D2 and the return of Trials ultimately. J-Man said, why is that? Chris Barrett said, no idea. Team and studio priorities, I guess. And then there were more questions about how the team actually were able to produce these pieces of content with few members and in relatively short periods of time. And Chris Barrett said it was a Herculean effort, and that was just the core team, but it does take a lot of people to ship final content. Ultimately, when you think about it, as House of Wolves was being produced, Bungie were also in the core stages of building the Taken King. And at that time, Bungie were benefiting from the fact that they built masses of Destiny content which wasn't actually shipped with the original game, right? With Taken King in particular kind of being a scrapped piece of content content or part of the original Destiny story that was then reworked into something larger for the Taken King. So Bungie's legacy of building lots of different concepts and destinations, same way that EDZ existed before D1 ever released but was too large to even ship with the game, then we got it in D2, and now there's conversation about potentially going to Old Chicago in one of the 2026 or 27 expansions, depending on when they actually drop. And of course, that's a destination that has been in concept for a long time and maybe even in development in some capacity. And on the subject of those development assets, somebody said, how many of the assets were new versus repurposed for Prison of Elders from the Reef Raid? Early D1 trailers also showed us Osiris at an early version in the Lighthouse and a pan shot of an early Vestian outpost. How was the original plan for those locations actualized in House of Wolves as we got it? And Barrett said some of the early cutscene geometry was leveraged for the Vestian outpost and Lighthouse spaces, but almost all of the content for Prison of Elders was new, apart from using existing enemies. Although the never created Reef Raid was an inspiration, so that makes it sound like the Reef Raid was never actually built out in any capacity really, but was more of a concept instead. So it's an interesting insight into that era of Destiny, and a lot of people don't like what they've heard about Chris Barrett and his behavior at Bungie, but while it's absolutely not a justification for anything that may have happened, Chris Barrett was really instrumental in actually building Destiny from the very early stages, and often kind of looped back around as the game director to save the day, right? He was a big part of Rise of Iron. Then after Destiny 2 dropped and had serious issues, he took a key role in kind of trying to redirect the game as they moved towards Forsaken. So, like it or not, Chris Barrett's a very big part of Destiny history in terms of actual development, which is probably also why they were put on the Marathon team. And we've heard that Marathon changed significantly from its original kind of inspirations. Chris Barrett also spoke to an outlet here and said the original inspiration was not Tarkov or extraction shooters, it was Dark Age of Camelot, where they envisioned Marathon as more of a tense living world experience filled with co-op player stories and potential danger of other players. Extraction was just a convenient mechanic leveraged to create a 15-minute game loop where players in the same session have multiple opportunities to succeed or fail. Which is kind of a different outlook or concept to the pure 15-minute, 20-minute game mode extraction shooter in the traditional sense, and more of a persistent co-op world for Marathon with the extraction element. To me, actually sounds more interesting, but I'm not necessarily a massive fan of what is the established extraction shooter right now. And that's where I think, games like Destiny have had loads of potential in that space as well. Lawless Frontier is kind of an example of something like that, where it's very large, open scale, you have the freedom to go to different areas and explore, but there is still an objective pathway, and ultimately a conclusion for the game mode. However, more of a living world version of that, to me, sounds pretty interesting, but obviously, as Bungie kind of restarted development for Marathon, it did get kind of an early reboot in a lot of ways, probably because that vision was far more complex and would have taken more development time than what Bungie have ultimately gone for with Marathon now. Either way, interesting to talk about. It's cool to reflect on the golden years of Destiny, or some of them at least. For those of us who've been playing for 10 years, I think House of Wolves into Taken King was a really good period of time. Then we had that content lull after Taken King a few months later, where eventually Rise of Iron showed up. Overall though, it was a lot of fun. I miss those days, man. Share your thoughts in the comment section. I thought it was an interesting discussion, while there's not too much more really to talk about with D2 at the minute that's new. So if you've enjoyed the video, a rating would help us out as well. Plus get subscribed and I'll keep you up to date with more content. But otherwise, cheers for watching, and I hope you guys have an awesome day.